There was a place on Earth where time stopped meaning the same as it did in the rest of the world, where one morning could be the last, and where the number tattooed on the arm forever replaced the name a mother had given her son. That place had a name: Auschwitz, and for 4.5 years it functioned as the most efficient extermination machine humanity has ever built. It was not an accident of history. It was not the improvised delirium of a regime in crisis. It was the calculated product of decisions made in formal meetings, outlined in architectural plans signed by engineers, carried out by men who later returned home to have dinner with their families. Historian Dr. James Bulgin has documented it precisely. Auschwitz did not appear overnight. It was a construction project that lasted for years, involving dozens of private companies, thousands of workers, and a German bureaucracy that ordered supplies of poison with the same administrative logic used for fertilizer or cement. Between 1940 and 1945, at least 1.3 million people were deported to this complex of more than 40 camps. At least 1.1 million died. 960,000 were Jews. 74,000 were non-Jewish Poles, 21,000 were Roma and Sinti, 15,000 were Soviet prisoners of war. The most widely accepted calculations published by Polish historian Franciszek Piper in 1991 and adopted by Yad Vashem establish that 1 in every 6 Jews murdered during the Holocaust died in Auschwitz. It is the largest mass murder perpetrated in a single location in all recorded human history. But to understand what Auschwitz truly was, one must look from the inside. One must understand who built it, who commanded it, and the logic behind each of its mechanisms. This is the story of Auschwitz from the German perspective, not to understand it, nor much less to justify it, but so that the horror is so concrete, so documented, so irrefutable, that it can never again be claimed that it did not happen. The place chosen by the Reich. A barracks turned into an instrument of death. The city was called Oświęcim in Polish. The Germans called it Auschwitz when they annexed this area in the south of Poland to the Reich in September 1939, incorporating it first into the Gau Silesia and then from 1941 into the Gau Upper Silesia. It was a small city with ordinary architecture, crossed by the Sawa River, about 50 kilometers southwest of Krakow. Its streets foretold nothing. Its inhabitants, about 15,000 before the war, could not imagine that their name would become synonymous with the worst that humanity is capable of. The idea of building a camp at that location emerged in February 1940. Arpad Wiegand, an inspector of the Sicherheitspolizei, the security police, and subordinate to Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, the high commander of the SS and the police in Silesia, identified the site as a convenient option. They needed a place to confine the Polish political prisoners who were accumulating in the region's jails. The infrastructure already existed. An old Polish army barracks originally built for the Austro-Hungarian artillery of Upper Silesia. 22 brick buildings, 8 of them 2-story, arranged in an orderly grid. The concentration camp inspector Richard Glucks sent Walter Eisfeld, former commander of the Sachsenhausen camp in Oranienburg, to evaluate the site. His report was favorable. In April 1940, Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, personally approved the creation of the camp. He signed the authorization upon recommendation from SS Obersturmbannführer Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss, a member of the concentration camp inspectorate. That name, Rudolf Höss, will appear repeatedly throughout this story. The camp measured approximately 1 kilometer in length by 400 meters in width. The area of interest, Interessengebiet, that the SS would build around it would cover 40 square kilometers, confiscated from its Polish inhabitants and cleared of any civilian presence. By the end of 1940, the Gestapo, the SS, and the local police patrolled that perimeter as if it were exclusive Reich territory. The first 30 prisoners arrived on May 20th, 1940. They were not Jews, they were German criminals, the so-called Grünen, the Greens, for the green triangles sewn onto their uniforms brought from the Sachsenhausen camp. They would function as kapos, block supervisors, the first administrative gears of terror. The number 1 was assigned to Bruno Brodniewicz, who became Lagerälteste, the dean of the prisoners. The first mass transport arrived on June 14, 1940, from Tarnow, Poland. 728 Polish political prisoners, including Catholic priests and some Jews, although the latter were not selected for being Jews but for being political opponents. They were assigned numbers from 31 to 758. Rudolf Höss, the man who built hell, the architect of death. He was born on November 25, 1900 in Baden-Baden, on the outskirts of the Black Forest. Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss grew up in a neighborhood of scattered farms where his neighbors never imagined that the news cameras of the post-war period would end up filming. His father, Franz Xavier Höss, was a traveling salesman, although the family proudly recalled that the paternal grandfather had fallen as a colonel leading his regiment in the 1870 battle against France. Militarism was not an imported ideology, it was a genealogical inheritance. But Franz Xavier also had another obsession, religious devotion. He had made a solemn vow that his only son would become a priest. Since Rudolf had the use of reason, the direction of his life was set. He would be a priest. Höss's childhood was marked by this tension. On one hand, a father who instilled military obedience toward every figure of authority. I was constantly taught in energetic terms that I must promptly obey the wishes and orders of my parents, teachers, priests, and all adults, including the servants, he would later write from his cell in Krakow. On the other hand, his own fascination with horses, stables, and forests, which distanced him from any spiritual vocation. When he was 6 years old, the family moved to Mannheim and lost the stables. For weeks, he was almost sick with melancholy. On his 7th birthday, they gave him Hans, a pony with a long mane and vivid coal-black eyes, to whom he would confide his secrets for years because, as he wrote, I was convinced that he understood me. He was a solitary child, unable to show affection even for his younger sisters, resistant to any display of tenderness. At 13, an incident occurred that broke his faith. During a school fight, he accidentally knocked a classmate down the gym stairs and fractured his ankle. He went to confession on Saturday, as he did every week, but his confessor was a close friend of his father. The following Sunday, his father called him to account. The seal of confession had been broken. Höss processed it with the relentless logic of a teenager who had built his entire moral view around the sanctity of that seal. If the priesthood could betray, the priesthood did not deserve his loyalty. He stopped going to confession with that priest, then stopped going to confession altogether. The childhood faith, he writes, was shattered. His father died that same year. The morning was light, according to Höss's own confession. I was perhaps too young to fully appreciate my loss. What he noticed intensely was that his relatives divided the family possessions, assuming he would become a missionary and that his personal future no longer belonged to him. He decided overnight to renounce his share of the inheritance in favor of his sisters, signed the documents with a lawyer, and categorically refused to enter the seminary. He was 14 years old. In 1916, with World War I in its second year, Höss managed, with the help of a cavalry captain he had met in field hospitals, where he went to hear stories from the front since the early days of the conflict, to enlist in the 21st Baden Dragoner Regiment, the same unit in which his father and grandfather had served. He did this without his mother knowing, who would die the following year without knowing that her son was fighting. He was 15 years old when he was sent to the front. First, to the Mesopotamian front, where he fought in extreme desert conditions alongside Turkish divisions against British New Zealand and Indian troops. Then he was transferred to the Palestine front, where he operated on the Hejaz Road and in the Jerusalem sector. In his first combat near the Jordan River, the soldier next to him fell dead. Blood poured from a severe head wound, and he was already dead. Höss describes the panic that paralyzed him for a few seconds until he saw his captain calmly firing from behind a rock. Then he began to shoot. He killed a tall Indian soldier with a black beard whom he describes in photographic detail. "My first dead," he writes. The spell was broken. He shot non-stop. The captain, after the combat, was amazed by his composure under fire, not knowing how deeply it had shaken me inside. That captain became a substitute father figure, my soldier father. And when he fell in the Second Battle of the Jordan in the spring of 1918, Höss mourned him more deeply than his biological father. Between 1917 and 1918, he was wounded twice. He received the First and Second Class Iron Crosses, the Turkish Iron Crescent Medal, and the Baden Service Medal. He was the youngest non-commissioned officer in the German army to receive those decorations. He was 17 years old. At the end of the war, upon returning to Germany in 1918, Höss found a country in disintegration. He had no home, no profession, no life plan other than the uniform. His mother had died, his sisters were in the convent, the home was gone. He joined the Freikorps Rossbach, one of the many paramilitary volunteer corps operating on the margins of the Weimar Republic. They fought in the Baltic states against Bolsheviks and local nationalists in the Ruhr and in the Baltic, bound by a personal loyalty oath to the leader of the corps and by the code that betrayal was punished with death. On the night of May 31st to June 1st, 1922, Höss participated in the murder of Walter Kaddow, a schoolteacher whom the Freikorps had identified as a communist spy infiltrated in the organization. The official version of the group was that Kaddow had informed the nationalist hero Albert Leo Schlageter to the French occupying authorities of the Ruhr, which had cost Schlageter his life. Notes from the German editor's court in the book state that there is no proof of this connection, and that the court that judged the case in Leipzig determined that Kaddow was caught, beaten nearly to death with sticks and branches, had his throat cut, and was finished off with 2 revolver shots. Martin Bormann, who would become Hitler's personal secretary, was indirectly involved in the matter and received a lesser sentence. Höss assumed the main guilt during the interrogation to protect the comrade who had physically executed the crime. He was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. In prison, under severe military discipline and solitary confinement as a political prisoner, he developed what he himself described as a practical philosophy of obedience. Every assigned task had to be performed exactly and thoroughly, regardless of its nature. He was released from prison in 1928 following a general amnesty. He was 27 years old and knew no other life than that of combat and hierarchy. He briefly joined the Arteman League, a Völkisch agrarian movement that promoted a return to the land and to German blood as the root of the nation. There he met Heinrich Himmler, who was also an enthusiastic member of the same league at the time. He also met Hedwig Hensel there, whom he married in 1929 and with whom he had 5 children. In the Arteman League, he learned to cultivate the land, care for livestock, and manage a farm. It was the only genuinely civilian pause in his life. In 1934, upon Himmler's recommendation, Höss joined the SS with the rank of SS Unterscharführer. He was assigned to the Dachau concentration camp on the outskirts of Munich under the command of SS Brigadeführer Theodor Eicke. Eicke was the theorist who was codifying the German concentration camp system at that time, its regulations, its hierarchies, its vocabulary. Every aspect of institutional brutality had a written rule at Dachau, a responsible rank, a formal procedure. Höss was a model student in that environment. He rose to SS Hauptscharführer in 1936 and SS Untersturmführer in 1938. By 1938, he was transferred to the Sachsenhausen camp in Oranienburg, where he continued his training under the same Eicke system, this time as a commanding officer. When in April 1940, Himmler needed someone to build a new camp from scratch in newly occupied Polish territory, he chose Höss for the specific knowledge of what this man was. Not a creator, but a disciplined executor. A man who had learned from the age of 6 that what the elders said was always right. Höss himself acknowledged this in his memoirs with a clarity that is more disturbing than any denial. If the Führer himself had given the order for the cold, calculated murder of millions of innocent men, women, and children, it was not for me to question whether that order was correct. I lacked the necessary perspective. It wasn't pretense. It was the perfect description of a psychological system he had been building for 4 decades. Total obedience as the highest value, incompatible with autonomous moral reflection. A child whose father woke him up in the middle of the night for forgetting to hang the horse's saddle. A teenager who believed that the orders from the confessional could violate the sacred seal if authority demanded it. A 15-year-old soldier who learned that killing is easier when the captain is calm. After all that, what arrived at Auschwitz in May 1940 was not a monster. It was a perfectly prepared official. Höss installed his family in the 2-story white stucco house adjacent to the command building. Hedwig Höss described this house years later as her favorite place in the world. A flower-filled garden, an orderly domestic life, horseback rides around the area of interest. The children played in the garden. From the first floor, if one got close to the windows of the northern wing, the roof of crematorium one could be seen. Some of those windows were painted over or blocked. It is not entirely clear for whom the benefit of this opacity was intended. When, on November 11, 1943, Höss handed over command to Arthur Lieberhenschel and joined the Central Office of SS Affairs and Administration in Oranienburg as the director of the Amt die Ordnung, the inspection department for the camps, he had spent 3.5 years at the head of the largest extermination center in history. He had overseen the death of hundreds of thousands of people. He returned to Auschwitz between May 8 and July 29, 1944, to oversee the arrival of Hungarian Jews with the title of Standortältester, the highest-ranking officer of the entire garrison. He personally witnessed the days when the crematoriums were overwhelmed and bodies burned in open pits. He took administrative note of the numbers. In his memoirs, there is not a single line of genuine remorse. There are, however, complaints about the inefficiency of the staff, about logistical issues with the supply of Zyklon B, about the difficulty of maintaining secrecy when the smoke from the pyres was visible from surrounding villages. He was arrested on March 11, 1946, by the British in a farm near Flensburg in the far north of Germany. He was living under the pseudonym Franz Lang, working as an agricultural labourer. The soldiers who captured him severely beat him before taking him to the Haida prison. He was then transferred to Minden in the British-occupied zone to be interrogated. From there, he was taken to Nuremberg, where he testified with a detached and detailed attitude that equally impressed and disturbed the prosecutors. He confirmed that at least 2.5 million people had been gassed at Auschwitz, a number he later considered too high in his subsequent memoirs, that the orders came from Himmler and that he had executed them without questioning them because a soldier receives his orders and carries them out. Extradited to Poland on May 25, 1946, he wrote his autobiography, Commandant in Auschwitz, in the Krakow prison at the request of the Polish criminologist Dr. Stanisław Batalia, who had held 13 conversations with him. The trial before the Supreme National Court of Warsaw began on March 11, 1947. On April 2nd, he was found guilty. On April 16th, he was taken to Auschwitz I and hanged at the same gallows next to Crematorium I, a few meters from the house where his family had lived while he managed everything. The structure of the gallows, 3 metal posts joined by a regular railway rail at the top, was of a deliberate simplicity that his contemporaries interpreted as mockery. Höss would have read it probably as efficiency. The architecture of crime, plans, engineers, and the business of killing. In August 2009, during a ceremony held in Berlin, the editor-in-chief of the German newspaper Bild, Kai Diekmann, handed over 29 original architectural blueprints of the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp to then Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for safekeeping at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem. These blueprints, drawn to a 1:100 scale, had been discovered in 2008 in a Berlin residence. They were authenticated by experts from the German Federal Archives. The documents, dated between 1941 and 1943, showed with millimeter detail the expansion plans for the camp, residential blocks, medical facilities, crematories, and gas chambers. Many of them contained marginal notes and signatures from high-ranking SS officials, including Himmler himself. One of them, dated November 8, 1941, showed the plans for a purification building with a gas chamber, a building that was never ultimately constructed. Another, dated November 30, 1941, detailed the crematorium II of Birkenau. There was also a 2-dimensional sketch of the entrance to the Birkenau camp, today one of the most recognizable images of the 20th century. Nothing was improvised. The chief architect of the Birkenau construction was SS Sturmbannführer Karl Bischoff, who headed the construction directorate of the Waffen-SS and Police Auschwitz Upper Silesia, established on October 1, 1941. Under his orders, engineers and draftsmen from the SS worked alongside technically skilled prisoners who were forced to produce the plans that would condemn them as well. Herta Soswinski, a prisoner who worked as an office worker in that office, later testified after the war that the office was responsible not only for planning, but also for supervising execution, supplying materials, and controlling quality. Private companies played a central role. The most important was Topf und Söhne, Topf and Sons from Erfurt, which designed and built the crematory furnaces. Their engineers made technical visits to the camp, reported in writing on the combustion capacity of the furnaces, and proposed efficiency improvements. Their files, recovered after the war, reveal perfectly ordinary bureaucratic correspondence: orders for components, maintenance reports, payment requests. The business of cremating human beings on an industrial scale had its own invoices. The chemical company IG Farben, the most powerful conglomerate in Germany, chose a plot of land near the villages of Dwory and Monowitz in German, to build a Buna N synthetic rubber factory, essential for the war effort. They chose this site specifically for its proximity to the concentration camp, cheap labor available in unlimited quantities. In February 1941, Himmler ordered that the Jewish population of Auschwitz be expelled to make room for skilled workers, that the Poles who were able to work remain in the city, and that Auschwitz prisoners be used in construction. IG Farben paid the SS between 3 and 4 Reichsmark for each 9 to 11-hour shift worked by each prisoner. It was a standard commercial agreement signed with official seals. Between 1943 and 1944, about 35,000 prisoners worked at the Monowitz plant. 23,000 died, an average of 32 per day. Within 3 to 4 months in the camp, historian Peter Hayes writes, the prisoners were reduced to walking skeletons. Deaths and transfers to the gas chambers reduced the population by nearly 1/5 each month. When workers were no longer useful, they were replaced. The factory never fully operated. It was bombed by the Allies on August 20th, September 13th, and December 18th and 26th, 1944. Krupp and Siemens Schuckert also built production facilities nearby with their own sub-camps. Around 28 nearby camps operated in the Auschwitz influence zone, each housing hundreds to thousands of prisoners. The prisoners also worked in coal mines, foundries, chemical plants, and agricultural fields. In the Wirtschaftshof, Budi subcamp, near Brzeźcia, they were forced to work 12 hours a day in the fields, take care of animals, and produce compost by mixing human ashes from the crematories with grass and manure. Life inside death, the daily regime of the camp. Meanwhile, in the SS accommodations, the dawn had a different rhythm. The non-commissioned officers and guards woke up later than the prisoners, had running water, regular showers, and spare uniforms. They had breakfast with fresh bread, cold cuts, and real coffee or high-quality substitutes in the barracks dining rooms before reporting for service or the morning roll call. Senior officers, including the camp commander, typically woke up even later, were attended to by orderlies, and had breakfast in separate rooms with dishes, tablecloths, and the Reich press on the table. The writer Gisela Perl, a Romanian Jewish gynecologist who survived the women's camp, wrote in 1948, "There was one latrine for every 30 to 32,000 women, and we were only allowed to use it at certain hours of the day. We would line up to enter this tiny building, sinking up to our knees in human excrement." Breakfast consisted of half a litre of coffee substitute or a herbal infusion, no solid food. At noon, 3/4 of a litre of watery soup with vegetables 4 days a week with a bit of meat only occasionally. Dinner, 300 grams of frequently mouldy bread, from which they had to save some for the following day, accompanied by a spoonful of melted cheese or jam or 25 grams of margarine or sausage. Prisoners assigned to more physically demanding forced labor received slightly higher rations. The documented total caloric intake was around 1,500 calories, although survivors would consistently testify that it was much less. The consequences were visible. Within a matter of weeks, prisoners developed the cadaverous appearance that post-liberation photographs made world famous. For the German staff, however, the workday in Auschwitz outwardly resembled that of any garrison. After breakfast, formation, daily orders, and handling of administrative matters. The commander attended to reports, signed orders, reviewed statistics on prisoners, work, and mortality in his office, while the camp inspector or high-ranking SS officers appeared sporadically for brief inspections and courtesy visits, which usually ended in the officers' casino. The officers and SS officials alternated this desk work with selective tours of certain areas of the camp, almost always announced in advance, and avoided the spaces where dirt, overcrowding, and disease were most evident, delegating those to subordinates. After breakfast, the roll call, appel. The prisoners would line up outside in groups of 10, regardless of the weather. They waited for the SS officers to arrive for the count. If a prisoner was missing, the rest would stand until the absent one was found or the reason for their absence was clarified. On July 6, 1940, the first roll call following the escape of Polish prisoner Tadeusz Wiejowski lasted 19 hours. After an escape in 1941, a group of prisoners from the barrack of the fugitive were selected and sent to Block 11 to die of starvation. The ordinary workday lasted 11 hours, longer in the summer, a little shorter in winter. The prisoners marched to work to the sound of the cry Arbeitskommandos formieren, form work groups, in columns of 5. A prisoners' orchestra, including the famous Orchestra der Frauen, the women's orchestra of Auschwitz, was forced to play cheerful music as the workers left the camp. The kapos and SS escorts were responsible for the behavior during the day. The work was mostly done outdoors: construction, excavation, gravel pits, sawmills. No breaks were allowed. A prisoner was specifically assigned to the letters to measure how long it took for the workers to urinate and eat. For the guards, those same hours were divided into shifts: surveillance in the towers and fences, armed escort of the work commandos, service in the punishment blocks, or administrative duties in the camp offices and the labor, registration and health departments. The non-commissioned officers dined in canteens with enough food and beer or spirits when available, before retiring to relatively comfortable dormitories. The officers often spent many nights in the casino, between conversations, alcohol and card games, while in the prisoners' barracks the stoves were lit when they worked, and the struggle for a few inches of space in the beds began. The second roll call took place at 7 in the evening. If the total number of prisoners didn't match, the formation continued until it did. It could last for hours. During these roll calls, executions by hanging and beatings took place. The curfew was signaled by a gong at 9 in the evening. The prisoners slept in long rows of brick or wooden beds, crowded with several per platform. Doctor and writer Miklos Niesli, who survived Auschwitz, too working as an assistant to Dr. Josef Mengele, described the nights in the barracks. From 800 to 1,000 people were crammed into the stacked compartments of each barrack. Unable to stretch out fully, they slept both lengthwise and widthwise, with one man's feet on another's head, neck, or chest. Deprived of all human dignity, they pushed, elbowed, bit, and kicked each other, trying to gain a few more inches of space. The wooden barracks of Birkenau were particularly brutal. They measured approximately 35 meters long by 11 meters wide and were divided into 62 compartments of 4 square meters, each originally designed for 3 prisoners and later expanded to 4. The personal space was 1 square meter to sleep and store belongings. Writer Robert Jan van Pelt has documented that these conditions deprived the inmates of the minimum space needed to exist. The barracks at Birkenau, unlike the brick buildings of Auschwitz I, were wooden structures with no thermal insulation. In winter, the Polish cold penetrated unimpeded. Temperatures in this region can drop to 20 degrees below zero. Prisoners arriving from Mediterranean countries, Greece, Italy, Yugoslavia, died in devastating proportions during the first days. The stoves installed in some barracks worked irregularly and sometimes simply didn't work at all. Hygiene was a matter of survival. The only uniform given to the prisoners had to last for weeks or months. The weekly shower, Sundays, the only day without mandatory work, was with cold water. Often there was no soap. Parasitic and bacterial diseases, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, circulated at the speed allowed by 50,000 people sharing facilities designed for 10,000. For the German staff, that same work-free Sunday meant a reduced service day, mass or political events for those who wished, weapon maintenance, writing reports, walks around the surrounding area, or visits to families living near the camp. The contrast was absolute. While the prisoners froze in the showers without soap, many officers and their families could bathe with hot water in well-equipped service houses just a few hundred meters from the crematories. Writer Primo Levi, a survivor of Auschwitz III, described a camp bathroom in 1944. It is poorly lit, full of drafts, with the brick floor covered by a layer of mud. The water is not drinkable. It has a repulsive odor and often runs out for many hours. The walls were painted with educational images showing the good prisoner clean and smiling, facing the bad prisoner with an anti-Semitic appearance and dirty clothes. Under each image, a slogan in German. The branding system, triangles, numbers, and the hierarchy of horror. Only in Auschwitz were prisoners tattooed with a serial number. In no other concentration camp in the Reich was this identification method used systematically. Soviet prisoners of war received the tattoo on their left chest, civilians on the left forearm on the inner side. The ink used for the tattoos, according to later documentation, was from the company Pelikan, which continues to operate today. The number replaced the name. Historian Agata Miowska, an educator guide at the Camp Museum, has summarized it. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, prisoners were shaved, disinfected, stripped of all belongings, dressed in striped uniforms and marked with the number that from that moment would be their only identity recognized by the system. No name, no history, no past. The categories of prisoners were also distinguished by triangular pieces of fabric, Winkel, sewn onto the uniforms under the number. Political prisoners, Schutzhäftlinge, mostly Polish, wore a red triangle. German common criminals, Berufsverbrecher, wore green. The so-called asocials, vagrants, prostitutes, Roma, wore black. Jehovah's Witnesses wore purple. Homosexuals wore pink. Jews wore the yellow Star of David, eventually overlapped by a second triangle if they belonged to another category. The embroidered letter indicated the nationality, P for Polish, F for French, and so on. On this geometry of exclusion operated an explicit racial hierarchy. German prisoners at the top, then non-Jewish prisoners from other nationalities, and Jews at the bottom. The so-called Funktionshäftlinge, prisoners in positions of authority, were initially non-Jewish Germans, although over time they also included Jews and Poles. The Lager Prominenz, the elite of the camp, included the Blockschreiber, block clerk, the Capo, work supervisor, the Stubendienst, barrack orderly, and the commissioners. By exercising power over other prisoners, many earned a reputation as sadists. Polish historian Irena Strzelecka has documented that the Kapos received nicknames that reflected their cruelty: bloodthirsty, iron, the strangler, the boxer. Very few were prosecuted after the war, as the distinction between actions done under orders and those done on personal initiative was difficult to prove. Block 11 and the instruments of punishment, prison within a prison. Known as Block 13 until 1941, Block 11 of Auschwitz I was the most feared punishment structure in the camp, a prison within a prison. It was home to the local Gestapo section, formerly designated as Polizei-Ersatzgefängnis Myslowitz in Auschwitz, the Auschwitz branch of the Mysłowicz police station, and the place where prisoners suspected of resistance activities, escape attempts, or any other violations were sent. Documented infractions that led prisoners to Block 11 include returning to seek a second food ration, removing gold teeth to buy bread, entering the pigsty to steal food for the pigs, putting hands in pockets. Based on the 275 punishment reports preserved in the Auschwitz archives, Strzelecka catalogued these and other equally trivial infractions. Cell 22 of Block 11 was the Stehbunker, the standing cell, without windows, divided into 4 compartments of less than 1 square meter each, accessible through a hatch close to the floor. Up to 4 prisoners could be locked in each compartment. The only air vent was a 5 by 5 centimeter grate with a perforated sheet. Prisoners were required to remain standing in that space for entire nights. Prisoner Wisław Kieler spent 4 weeks in cell 22 for having broken a pipe. Flagellation during roll calls was routine. The punishments were carried out on a table called the goat, Diebock, which immobilized the prisoners' feet while they were stretched over it. Prisoners had to count the lashes aloud, 25 received with many thanks. And if they made a mistake in the number, the punishment would start over from the beginning. The standard number was 25 lashes. The punishment, called the post, Pfahl, involved tying the prisoners' hands behind their backs with chains, then lifting them by their arms until they were suspended by their wrists. Shoulder dislocations were frequent. According to museum documentation, prisoners subjected to this method were later sent to the gas chamber when their shoulders were so damaged that they could no longer work. The courtyard between blocks 10 and 11, surrounded by a black brick wall, was known as the Wall of Death, Todeswand. The first executions at this location took place on November 11, 1941, Polish National Independence Day. 151 accused were led to the wall one by one, naked with their hands tied behind their backs, and executed with a small-caliber shot to the back of the neck. Small-caliber weapons were used to reduce noise. It is estimated that around 4,500 Polish political prisoners were executed at that wall, including members of the resistance. Another 10,000 Poles were brought to the camp to be executed without ever being registered as prisoners. Among those executed were Colonel Jan Karcz and Major Edward Gut-Gutiński, who were shot on January 25, 1943, along with 51 others suspected of resistance activities. Józef Nogi, a Polish long-distance runner, was executed on February 15th of the same year. SS officer Perry Broad, who worked in the political section of the camp, wrote in a report about the prisoners awaiting execution. Some of these walking skeletons had spent months in the pestilent cells, where not even animals were kept and they could barely stand. Yet in that final moment many of them shouted, "Long live Poland!" or "Long live freedom!" The first gas and the path to Birkenau, from pesticide to extermination weapon. In the summer of 1941, Lagerführer Karl Fritsch approached Rudolf Höss with a proposal. Fritsch had been experimenting elsewhere with a pesticide used in agriculture called Zyklon B in German, whose active ingredient was hydrogen cyanide. He had discovered that when the product's crystals were thrown into a closed space where people were breathing, the reaction was lethal. He proposed testing it at Auschwitz. Zyklon B had arrived at the camp with a perfectly ordinary purpose: to disinfect clothing and kill insects in the uniforms. In Block 3 of the camp, museum researchers have found and documented the bluish stains the product left on the walls when it was first used for disinfestation. They were, literally, the physical traces of the first step in a chain that would lead to industrial murder. The first use of Zyklon B to kill humans took place in the basement of Block 11 in August or early September 1941. The most accepted figures indicate that approximately 850 people, Soviet prisoners of war and sick Polish inmates, were introduced into that basement and gassed. The operation was problematic. The space was inadequate for ventilation, and the prisoners took between 2 and 3 days to die with the first doses. The Nazis recalibrated the quantities and conditions. The result showed them that the method worked and that they needed a better space. The solution was just a few meters away. A former Polish military depot had been reused as a morgue and later as a crematorium. In early 1942, the SS adapted it as a gas chamber, thus creating the first crematorium one of Auschwitz. Its 3 furnaces, installed by May 1942, could incinerate 340 bodies in 24 hours. The morgue was expanded into a gas chamber with a capacity for between 700 and 800 people. Zyklon B was introduced through vents in the ceiling. To maintain order, victims were told they were going to take a shower or be disinfected. They were ordered to undress outside, then locked in and gassed. Crematorium 1 operated from August 1940 to July 1943, when the Birkenau facilities took over. During that period, according to the testimony of Philipp Müller, one of the members of the Sonderkommando at Auschwitz I, tens of thousands of Jews from France, the Netherlands, Slovakia, Upper Silesia and Yugoslavia, as well as from the ghettos of Theresienstadt, Ciechanów and Grodno, were killed in that building. Jean-Claude Pressac estimated the total number of victims in Crematorium 1 at up to 10,000. Today, the building is a post-war reconstruction made with original materials. The chimney has been recreated, 4 openings have been installed in the ceiling to show where Zyklon B entered, and 2 of the 3 furnaces were rebuilt with original components. The inadequacy of Crematorium 1 prompted the construction of a new complex. In October 1941, 3 kilometers north of the main camp, in the grounds of the village of Brzezinka, construction began for Auschwitz II. The world would come to know it as Birkenau. Birkenau, the industry of death, the camp that the world will never forget. To build Birkenau, 7 Polish villages were evacuated, their inhabitants were expelled, their homes demolished. The swampy and exposed land was chosen, according to the testimony of Polish prisoner Alfred Czesław Przybylski, deliberately. The choice of the site, on wet land even though it could have been built on dry land, was intended to exterminate the prisoners working there and also those inhabiting the buildings. The chief of construction was SS Sturmbannführer Karl Bischoff, architect of the SS. The initial budget was 8.9 million Reichsmarks. Each barrack was designed to house 550 prisoners, a number which Bischoff increased to 744 when the plans were adjusted to accommodate 125,000 people instead of the originally planned 97,000. 174 barracks were built, each measuring 35.4 by 11 meters, divided into 62 compartments of 4 square meters. The first prisoners to work on the construction of Birkenau were 10,000 Soviet prisoners of war who arrived between October 7th and 25th, 1941. By March 1st, 1942, only 945 were still alive and were transferred to Auschwitz II. Most had died of hypothermia, starvation, or exhaustion before May 1942. They lived and died building their own extermination camp. The Birkenau complex was divided into separate sectors: a quarantine camp, a section for men, another for women, a Roma family camp, and a Theresienstadt family camp. Each sector had its own system of doors and fences. The central structure was the selection ramp, which, from May 1944, penetrated directly into the camp thanks to a new railway line built specifically for the arrival of Hungarian deportees. The first provisional gas chamber in Birkenau began operations around March 1942. It was located in what the prisoners called the Red House, Bunker 1, a former brick farmhouse whose windows had been bricked up and whose 4 rooms had been converted into 2 airtight gas chambers. The doors were marked Zur Desinfektion, for disinfection. A second house, the White House, Bunker 2, began service in June 1942. When Heinrich Himmler visited the camp on July 17th and 18th, 1942, he witnessed a complete demonstration: the selection of Dutch Jews on the ramp, transport by truck to Bunker 2, gassing, inspection of the corpse, and the visit to the construction site of Auschwitz III in Monowitz. The 4 final crematoria, crematoriums 2, 3, 4 and 5, began operations between March and June of 1943. Their plans had been prepared by the company Topfunzöhne and the SS Construction Directorate. Crematoriums 2 and 3 were symmetrical structures. In the underground floor, a changing room of 49.43 by 7.93 meters and a gas chamber of 30 by 7 meters. On the upper level, a furnace room of 30 by 11.24 meters. The interior walls of the gas chambers were white, with fake shower heads attached to the ceiling. The numbered hooks in the changing rooms were supposedly for the victims to identify their belongings after leaving the shower. The documented daily cremation capacity was 340 bodies in Crematorium 1, 1,440 in each of Crematoriums 2 and 3, and 768 in Crematoriums 4 and 5. Total 4,416 bodies daily. However, the Sonderkommando developed the technique of introducing 3 to 5 bodies simultaneously into each furnace when the bodies were very thin, as happened systematically with prisoners who had spent weeks in the camp, and reached numbers of up to 8,000 bodies incinerated per day. The average between 1942 and 1944 was 1,000 bodies daily. In the summer of 1944, when the Hungarian deportations peaked, the crematory's capacity proved insufficient. Behind Crematorium 5, outdoor cremation pits were dug where bodies were burned on mass pyres. The clandestine photographs taken by members of the Sonderkommando in August 1944, smuggled out of the camp in a toothpaste tube, show columns of smoke rising from these pyres and the Sonderkommando members themselves working under SS supervision. One of the photographs shows women, naked, walking toward the gas chamber amidst the vegetation surrounding the crematorium. The extermination process, the selection and what happened afterward. The deportees arrived at Auschwitz in cattle cars, sealed from the outside with no ventilation, no seats and no sanitary facilities. One single bucket served as the solution for the physiological needs of 80 or more people. The journeys lasted for days, from occupied Greece between 10 and 14 days, from Hungary 2 or 3, from the Netherlands between 3 and 5. Those who arrived dead during the journey represented a variable but constant proportion of the total. The others arrived dehydrated, sick and terrified. Upon descending from the train at the ramp, the selection process, selection, began. SS doctors, among them Joseph Mengele, who personally supervised the arrivals starting from May 30th, 1943, directed the new arrivals to the right or to the left with a gesture of the hand or the baton. Those selected for the left were sent to the gas chambers, those on the right to the camp. The operational rule was clear. Small children were invariably sent to the left, mothers with babies to the left, the elderly to the left, anyone with a visible disability, scars, bandages, limping, extreme weakness, to the left. In periods of higher influx, between 75 and 80% of those who descended from the train were selected for immediate death without being registered as prisoners. According to the calculations of historian Franciszek Piper of the 1,095,000 Jews deported to Auschwitz, approximately 205,000 were registered at the camp and received a serial number. 25,000 were transferred to other camps. 865,000 were gassed upon arrival without ever being registered. Adding non-Jewish victims, the number of unregistered victims rises to 900,000. Those selected to die were taken on foot or by truck if they were too weak to walk to the crematoriums. There, the final process began. They were told they were going to take a shower. They were ordered to undress. Hooks were assigned to them in the changing rooms, and they were instructed to memorize the number to recover their belongings after the shower. The lie was methodological. The experiments of Block 11 and the first months of operations had taught the SS that victims who understood what was happening could create uncontrollable panic situations. The fiction of the shower turned out to be operationally more efficient. SS member Perry Broad, a direct witness, described the procedure in one of Birkenau's crematoriums. The heads of the 6 openings on the roof were removed, and men wearing gas masks appeared above them. With hammers and chisels, they opened the cans of Zyklon B, labeled with poison warnings for use by trained personnel only, and threw the contents inside. The hatches were immediately closed. After a few minutes, the screams ceased. The moans continued a little longer, then silence. Zyklon B interfered with cellular respiration. The victims died from progressive chemical asphyxiation in a space where the human density raised the temperature and accelerated the vaporization of the product. Höss testified at Nuremberg that death could take up to 20 minutes. Subsequent forensic analysis suggests that the last heartbeats could occur until that moment, although the loss of consciousness occurred earlier. Lieb Langfuss, a member of the Sonderkommando who buried his diary, written in Yiddish, near Crematorium 3 of Auschwitz II and was found in 1952, described what they found when opening the chambers. The mothers were frozen sitting on the floor hugging their children, and the husbands died embracing. Some had turned completely blue under the influence of the gas, while others appeared completely fresh as if they were sleeping. A pile of 5 or 6 overlapping layers had formed, reaching a height of 1 meter. The Sonderkommando, prisoners, mostly Jewish, forced to operate the gas chambers under the threat of immediate death, opened the exit doors half an hour after the sounds ceased. Wearing gas masks, they extracted the corpses. They removed the glasses and prostheses. They shaved the women's hair. At Auschwitz, unlike other extermination camps, shaving was done post-mortem. Starting on September 23, 1940, by order of Himmler, gold was systematically extracted from the teeth. By October 8, 1942, 50 kilograms of dental gold had been collected this way. By early 1944, the monthly extraction was between 10 and 12 kilograms. The gold was sent to the SS Health Service, where it was used to assist members of the Corps and their families. The women's hair was washed in an ammoniacal saline solution, dried on the brick floor of the crematoriums, combed and packed into paper bags. By February 6, 1943, the Reich Ministry of Economics had received 3,000 kilograms of women's hair from Auschwitz and Majdanek. The product was sent to textile factories, including one in Bremen-Blumenthal, where workers found small coins with Greek inscriptions among some of the braids. They likely belonged to Greek Jews deported in 1943. When the Red Army liberated the camp in January 1945, they found 7,000 kilograms of human hair in bags ready to be sent. The Sonderkommando and those who knew, the bearers of the secret. The Sonderkommando Special Commands were prisoners who operated the crematoria under the direct supervision of the SS. Between 1940 and 1941, when there was only one gas chamber, there were 20 of them. By the end of 1943, there were 400. By 1944, during the Hungarian deportations, the number reached 874. They lived separated from the rest of the prisoners in specific barracks within the crematorium area. They were provided with somewhat more food than the others. They had access to the belongings of the victims, which allowed them to trade within the camp, sometimes even with the SS themselves. But they knew the secret. They had seen what happened at the bottom of the stairs that led to the chambers. Many had recognized friends, neighbors, and family members among the new arrivals, and they had to continue working. Every so often, approximately every 3 months, the Sonderkommando were killed and replaced by new prisoners. It was an operational security measure. Those who knew too much had to die. The cycle was systematic. Of the more than 800 who passed through this role throughout the existence of the camp, about 100 survived its liquidation. Several of them buried notes and diaries near the crematoria, hoping they would be found by their liberators. Zalman Gradowski buried his notebooks near Crematorium 3. After the war, another member of the Sonderkommando pointed out to prosecutors where to dig. Langfuss's notes, signed Ira, were found in 1952. The clandestine photographs of the Sonderkommando, smuggled out in September 1944, were the only visual documentation taken from inside the extermination process. On October 7, 1944, after the announcement that 300 of their members would be transferred to a nearby location to clean up debris, a common ruse before the killings, the Sonderkommando at Crematorium 4 rose up. They attacked the SS with stones and hammers, killing 3 of them, and set the building on fire with oil-soaked rags they had been hiding for weeks. The members of Crematorium 2, hearing the gunshots, believed the rebellion had started throughout the camp. They threw their Oberkapot into an active oven. After cutting the fence with pliers, they managed to reach Rajsko, where they hid in the barn of a sub-camp but were surrounded, and the SS set the building on fire with them inside. When the rebellion was suppressed, 212 members of the Sonderkommando were still alive. 451 had been killed. In October 1944, another 200 were executed as direct retaliation for their participation in the uprising. Medical experiments and the angel of death, science in the service of crime. Block 10 of Auschwitz I was designated as a medical experimentation laboratory. The SS doctors conducted experiments there using X-rays as a method of mass sterilization. They administered large doses of X-rays to the female prisoners to destroy their reproductive capacity. Karl Klauberg, a German gynecologist, injected chemicals into the women's wombs to try to close them through fibrosis. Other prisoners were infected with spotted fever to test vaccines or exposed to toxic substances to study their effects. In a documented experiment, the company Bayer, then part of IG Farben, paid the SS 150 Reichsmark for each of 150 Auschwitz prisoners selected to test an experimental anesthetic. The original requested price was 200 Reichsmark per woman. An employee from Bayer wrote to Rudolf Höss, "The transport of 150 women arrived in good condition. However, we were unable to obtain conclusive results because they died during the experiments. We kindly ask you to send us another group of women with the same amount and at the same price." The research was directed in Auschwitz by Dr. Helmuth Vetter of Bayer/1G Farben, who also held the rank of SS captain in collaboration with Drs. Friedrich Entrus and Edward Wirths. The most famous and infamous of the doctors at Auschwitz was SS Hauptsturmführer Josef Mengele, nicknamed the Angel of Death. Born in 1911 in Günzburg, Bavaria, he had obtained a doctorate in medicine and another in anthropology before the war. He arrived at Auschwitz II on May 30th, 1943, initially to work in the Gypsy family camp. Interested in identical twins, dwarfs, and people with hereditary diseases perceived as genetically relevant, he set up a kindergarten in Barracks 29 and 31 for the children with whom he experimented, as well as for all Romani children under 6 years old. They were given a slightly higher food ration there. Starting in May 1944, Mengele personally supervised the selections on the ramp, searching for his experimental subjects among the new arrivals. The twins were called to the front with the amplified shout over the camp's loudspeakers, Zwilling hurrah! Twins, step forward! He and other doctors under his supervision would measure parts of the twins' bodies, photograph them, conduct dental, visual and auditory tests, x-rays, blood tests, surgeries and blood transfusions between the siblings. When one of the twins died, Mengele would immediately have the other executed so that simultaneous autopsies could be performed. He wanted to observe comparative data. Dr. Kurt Heissmeyer, an SS officer, took 20 Jewish Polish children from Auschwitz to the Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg, where he injected them with the tuberculosis bacillus to test a cure. In April 1945, as the Allied troops were approaching, the 20 children were hanged at the Bullenhuser Dam School to eliminate the evidence of the experiment. The systematic collection of Jewish skeletons for the Reichsuniversität Strasbourg Anatomy Institute in Alsace-Lorraine was also documented. 115 prisoners were selected for their physical characteristics according to stereotypical racial criteria. 87 were sent to the Natzweiler Struthof camp and killed in August 1943. The directors of the project, Rudolf Brandt and Wolfram Sievers, the general director of the Ahnenerbe, the regime's research institute, were sentenced and executed in 1948 after the doctor's trial in Nuremberg. The camp system and its populations, those who arrived from all corners of Europe. The first mass transport of women arrived at Auschwitz on March 26, 1942. 999 non-Jewish German women from the Ravensbrück camp, classified as criminals, asocial and political, arrived to establish the women's camp as founding officers. The female guard from Ravensbrück, Johanna Langefeld, became the first Lagerführerin of the women's camp. On the same day, a second transport also arrived, 999 Jewish women from Poprad, Slovakia, the first transport sent to Auschwitz by Office 4B4 of the RSHA, the Jewish office, led by SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann. Around 30% of the registered prisoners were women. Their conditions were, if anything, worse than those of the men. When a group of male prisoners arrived at the women's camp in October 1942 to establish a hospital, their first task was to distinguish the bodies of women who were still alive. In the women's camp, sterilization experiments by Karl Klauberg and Horst Schumann were carried out. In February 1943, a separate camp for Roma people was established, the Zigeuner Familienlager, Gypsy Family Camp, in Sector B Wadie of Auschwitz II. For reasons that historians have not been able to determine with certainty, the Roma families were not subjected to immediate selection and were allowed to remain together. On February 26, 1943, the first transport of German Roma arrived. The camp records, Hauptbücher, showed 20,946 Roma as registered prisoners. It is believed that another 3,000 entered without being registered. On March 22, 1943, a transport of 1,700 Polish Sinti and Roma were gassed upon arrival due to suspected infectious disease. On May 16, 1944, the SS attempted to liquidate the camp, but the Roma resisted armed with knives and iron rods, and the SS withdrew. After transferring nearly 3,000 people from the camp for forced labor on August 2, 1944, the SS gassed the remaining 2,897 Roma. 10,000 remain missing. The SS also deported around 18,000 Jews from the Theresienstadt ghetto in Terezin, Czechoslovakia, starting on September 8, 1943. At the Theresienstadt family camp, Sector B, 1IB, they were allowed to keep their belongings, wear their own clothes, and write letters to their families. They were not subjected to selection. Correspondence between Eichmann's office and the International Red Cross suggests that the camp was created to distort reports of mass murders at Auschwitz in anticipation of the upcoming visit from the Red Cross. On March 8, 1944, 3,791 prisoners from the family camp were sent to the gas chambers, the men to Crematorium 3, the women to Crematorium 2. It was reported that several groups sang Hatikva and the Czech national anthem as they walked to their death. The Hungarian deportations, the paroxysm of extermination. In the spring of 1944, when the Soviet army was advancing from the east and the Western Allies were preparing for the Normandy landings, The SS launched the most massive deportation operation in the history of the camp. Their target was the 825,000 Jews of Hungary, the largest surviving Jewish group in occupied Europe, its code name Unternehmen Margaret. On April 29, 1944, the first 1,800 Hungarian Jews arrived at Auschwitz. To ensure the smooth flow of the process, the new railway line that penetrated directly into the camp up to the selection ramp was completed in the same month of May. From May 14th to early July 1944, 437,000 Hungarian Jews, half of the country's Jewish population before the war, were deported to Auschwitz at a rate of 12,000 per day for most of that period. To handle the volume, the crematoria were overhauled. Crematories 2 and 3 received new elevators that connected the ovens to the gas chambers, new grills were installed, and the changing rooms and gas chambers were painted. The Bunker 2, the Little White House, was reactivated. Cremation pits were dug behind Crematory 5. By the peak of the summer of 1944, the combined capacity of the crematories and outdoor cremation pits reached 20,000 bodies per day. 3/4 of the Hungarian deportees were sent directly to the gas chambers as soon as they descended from the train. The ramp was the threshold. The SS officer's gesture, right or left, was the sentence. Rudolf Höss, who had temporarily returned as the camp's chief officer to oversee this operation, described in his memoirs the logistical pressure of the period. The crematories could not handle the volume and had to be supplemented with outdoor pyres. The smell of burning bodies, according to his own testimony, reached the surrounding villages. A key testimony came from Rudolf Höss and Alfred Wetzler, 2 Slovak prisoners who escaped from the camp on April 27, 1944, and presented a detailed report to the Slovak Jewish Council. The Wetzler report included precise plans of the extermination facilities, victim numbers, and descriptions of the selection process. It was sent to the Allied governments and partially published in June 1944 by the Czechoslovak government in exile, contributing to the Hungarian government temporarily suspending deportations at the end of July 1944. By that time, 437,000 people had already been sent. Knowledge and silence, what the world knew and when it knew it. Information about Auschwitz reached the Allies much earlier than popular narratives have accepted. Captain Witold Pilecki of the Polish Home Army was the first agent to voluntarily infiltrate the camp. Under the false name of Tomasz Serafiński, serial number 4859, he had himself arrested in Warsaw on September 19, 1940, and was taken to Auschwitz. There he organized the resistance movement Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, ZOW, coordinated food and clothing distribution, and smuggled reports out of the camp. He was imprisoned from September 22, 1940, until his escape on April 27, 1943. His second report, the W report, estimated that 1.5 million people, mostly Jews, had been murdered at Auschwitz. The Polish resistance sent the first oral message about the camp with Alexander Wielkopolski in October 1940. The following month, the Warsaw Resistance prepared a report, which was partially published in London in May 1941. The report stated that almost no Jew left the camp alive. The Polish government in exile reported the gassing of prisoners on July 21, 1942. On September 4th of the same year, it reported the gassing of Soviet POWs and Jews. However, the Allied press responded with documented reluctance. Historian Michael Fleming has studied this silence. The caution of the British Foreign Office stemmed from the fear that public opinion would pressure the government to act or provide refuge to the Jews, and from concerns about Britain's relations in the Middle East. An equivalent reluctance existed within the US government and, surprisingly, within the Polish resistance itself. The question of whether the Allies should have bombed Auschwitz, the gas chambers, the crematoria, or the railway lines leading to the camp has sparked a historiographical debate that continues today. Historian David Wyman argued in 1978 in an essay published in Commentary magazine and later expanded in his book The Abandonment of the Jews, 1984, that the 15th Air Force of the United States in Italy had bombed the IG Farben plant at Auschwitz III on August 20th, September 13th, December 18th, and December 26th, 1944, demonstrating the technical feasibility of attacking the camp or its railway lines. Other historians, since the 1990s, have argued that the accuracy of the Allied bombings was insufficient for the proposed attack without causing mass casualties among the prisoners they sought to save. The end and the death marches, the evacuation and the final crime. In early November 1944, Heinrich Himmler ordered the suspension of the mass extermination at Auschwitz. On November 25th, he ordered the destruction of the gas chambers and crematoria. The Sonderkommando and other prisoners began the work of dismantling the buildings. On January 18, 1945, Engelbert Markech, a German criminal transferred from Mauthausen, received the last serial number assigned at Auschwitz, 202,499. Meanwhile, the Red Army was advancing from the east. Himmler ordered the evacuation of all the camps, instructing commanders to be personally responsible for ensuring that no prisoner fell alive into the hands of the enemy. The SS proceeded. Between January 17th and 21st, 1945, approximately 58,000 detainees from Auschwitz, two-thirds of them Jews, were evacuated under armed supervision, more than 20,000 from Auschwitz I and II, and over 30,000 from the subcamps. They began the march on foot towards the west in the middle of a Polish winter, with temperatures below freezing, wearing the striped camp uniforms and with no food. The SS shot or killed anyone who could not continue. Execution squads followed the column, eliminating those who lagged behind. Historian Peter Longerish estimated that a quarter of the detainees died in this manner during the march. From the subcamps and meeting points, the prisoners were then loaded onto uncovered freight cars to be transported to camps in the interior of Germany and Austria: Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Flossenbürg, Gross-Rosen, Mauthausen, Dora-Mittelbau, Ravensbrück, Sachsenhausen. On January 20, 1945, crematories 2 and 3 were blown up. On January 23rd, the Canada warehouses, the 30 barracks where the belongings confiscated from the victims were stored, were set on fire and burned for 5 days. Crematory 4 had been partially demolished after the Sonderkommando revolt. On January 26th, Crematory 5 was blown up, 1 day before the Red Army arrived. The liberation, what the Soviets found. On January 27, 1945, a Saturday, soldiers from the 100th Rifle Division of the Red Army entered Auschwitz III, the IG Farben camp of Monowitz, at 9 a.m. Later that same day, units from the 60th Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front arrived at Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II Birkenau around 3 p.m. They found 7,000 living prisoners in the 3 main camps, 500 in the subcamps, and more than 600 corpses. Among the items found, 837,000 women's garments, 370,000 men's suits, 44,000 pairs of shoes, and 7,000 kilograms of human hair in bags ready to be sent. The Krakow Institute of Forensic Sciences analyzed samples of the hair and found traces of hydrogen cyanide, the active component of Zyklon B, in both the shaved hair of living people and that of the dead. Soviet Colonel Georgy Elisavetsky described in 1980 what happened when he entered one of the barracks. He told the prisoners they were free. They didn't respond. He spoke to them in Russian, Polish, German, and Ukrainian. Nothing. Finally, he used Yiddish. "I am a colonel in the Soviet army and I am Jewish. We have come to liberate you." At that moment, Elisavetsky, I said, as if a barrier had collapsed, the prisoners ran toward the soldiers shouting, kneeled, kissed the flaps of their coats and embraced them. Primo Levi, who was in the Auschwitz III infirmary with scarlet fever when the liberators arrived, described the looks of the first 4 cavalry soldiers. They cast strangely embarrassed glances at the splayed bodies, the destroyed barracks, and the few of us who were still alive. That embarrassment, Levi wrote, was the shame that the Germans did not know, the one that the righteous man feels in the face of another's crime. The trials and memory, justice and its limits. Of the approximately 6,335 SS personnel who worked at Auschwitz throughout its existence, according to historian Alexander Lassik's calculations, only 789, at most 15%, were put on trial. Most of the cases were processed in Poland and in the Federal Republic of Germany. Rudolf Höss was arrested by the British on March 11, 1946, near Flensburg in northern Germany, where he had been working as a farmer under the pseudonym Franz Lang. He was taken to Nuremberg to testify in the trial of SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner. He was direct about his own role. He claimed to have followed orders from Himmler. On May 25, 1946, he was extradited to Poland. His trial before the Supreme National Court of Warsaw began on March 11, 1947. He was sentenced to death on April 2nd. On April 16, 1947, he was hanged at Auschwitz I, next to Crematorium I, near the house where he had lived with his family while overseeing the extermination process. On November 25, 1947, in Krakow, the trial of 40 former members of Auschwitz staff began, including Commander Arthur Lieberhenschel, the head of the women's camp Maria Mandl, and the camp chief Hans Aumeier. On December 22nd, the court issued 23 death sentences, 7 life sentences, and 9 prison sentences ranging from 3 to 15 years. The only acquitted was Hans Munch, an SS doctor who was supported by the testimony of several survivors who attested to his humane treatment. The Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt, held in West Germany between December 20, 1963 and August 20, 1965, judged 22 defendants over 180 days of hearings. The 700-page prosecution presented testimony from 254 witnesses. The court convicted 19 of the accused, 6 of them to life imprisonment and the others to prison sentences ranging from 3 to 10 years. Bruno Tesch and Karl Weinbacher, the owner and CEO of Tesch and Stabenow, one of the Zyklon B distributors, were executed by the British for knowingly supplying the product for use against humans. Dr. Horst Fischer, one of the highest-ranking SS doctors in the camp, had personally selected at least 75,000 men, women and children to be gassed. He was arrested in 1965 in the German Democratic Republic, sentenced to death in 1966, and executed by guillotine. He was the highest-ranking SS doctor at Auschwitz to be tried by a German court. Josef Mengele fled to South America after the war. He lived in Argentina, Paraguay and Brazil under false identities. He died by drowning in Bertioga, Brazil on February 7, 1979, without ever being tried for any of his crimes. The legacy: what Auschwitz left in the world. On July 2, 1947, the Polish government passed a law establishing the State Museum of Auschwitz-Birkenau on the grounds of Auschwitz I and II. In 1955, a permanent exhibition was inaugurated, displaying police photographs of prisoners, hair, suitcases and shoes taken from the victims, Zyklon B cartridges, and other material objects of extermination. In 1979, UNESCO included the camp in its World Heritage List. The number of visitors grew from 492,500 in 2001 to over 1 million in 2009 and to 2 million in 2016. Today, the museum receives approximately 2.3 million visitors annually from all over the world. The survivors who were able to tell the world became fundamental voices in the history of the 20th century. Primo Levi published If This Is a Man in 1947, a book that had initially been rejected by the Einaudi publisher, and would become one of the most translated and studied texts of the century. Elie Wiesel published Night in 1960, based on his experience at Auschwitz and Buchenwald. In 1986, he received the Nobel Peace Prize. Viktor Frankl, a surviving psychiatrist, published Man's Search for Meaning in 1946. Edith Eger wrote her memoirs decades later. Simone Weil, a survivor of Auschwitz, was elected president of the European Parliament and held the position from 1979 to 1982. Maximilian Kolbe and Edith Stein, 2 victims of the camp, were canonized by the Catholic Church. In 2005, the United Nations General Assembly designated January 27th, the date of the camp's liberation, as the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the Holocaust. A 2017 survey by the Kerber Foundation found that 40% of German youth aged 14 did not know what Auschwitz was. A survey by the Claims Conference and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, published in 2018, found that 41% of the U.S. adults surveyed and 66% of millennials did not know what Auschwitz was, while 22% said they had never heard of the Holocaust. Writer Elie Wiesel gave the following speech on the 50th anniversary of the liberation. I speak to you as a man who, 50 years and 9 days ago, had no name, no hope, no future, and was known only by the number A7713. I speak to you as a Jew who has seen what humanity has done to itself in attempting to exterminate an entire population. After Auschwitz, the human condition is no longer the same. After Auschwitz, nothing will ever be the same again. This statement is not a rhetorical exaggeration. It is a historical declaration. Auschwitz forever changed what human beings know about themselves, that under specific conditions of extreme ideology, efficient bureaucracy, and institutionalized obedience, ordinary men can build and operate a death factory. Monsters were not needed. Officials, engineers, doctors, guards, businessmen, and accountants were needed. Men with families, homes, and pressed uniforms, who each morning returned to their desks and signed the papers that made the machinery function. This is the true horror of Auschwitz. Not that it was impossible, but that it was possible.